Brothers and sisters, we have been lied to for too long, lied to by the history books, by the television screens, by the men in tall buildings who think they can define truth. They told you Africa was a jungle. They told you Africa was backward. They told you Africans were savages running around with bones in their noses, worshipping stones and rain clouds. But I ask you, who built the pyramids? Who carved cities out of stone long before Europe learned to build a two-story house? Who were the first doctors, the first scientists, the first scholars, when the so-called civilized world still thought the earth was flat? Africa is not the beggar. Africa is the robbed. Africa is not poor. Africa is rich. So rich that Europe, America, and now even Asia have fought each other just to lay hands on her soil. Gold in Ghana, diamonds in Congo, oil in Nigeria, uranium in Niger. The blood of the black man pumping wealth into the veins of foreign empires. They call it aid when they give back pennies for the dollars they stole. But the African doesn't need aid. The African needs justice. He needs his land. He needs his power. And he needs his identity back. Don't let them fool you into thinking you're not connected. Don't let them tell you that Africa is just a place over there, because the blood that runs through the veins of the man in Harlem is the same blood that runs through the warrior in Kenya, the mother in Senegal, the student in Uganda. You were ripped from that land, not just in body, but in mind. You were taught to hate your reflection because it reminded you of where you came from. They gave you new names, new gods, new flags, new lies. But here's the truth. You can't bury the roots of a tree and expect it to grow. A people without knowledge of their history are a people with no future. If the African in America doesn't recognize the African on the continent as his brother, then he remains an orphan in a house that was built on the backs of his ancestors. They try to divide us with flags, with languages, with fake borders drawn by men in European suits. But what tribe was the slave? What language did the chained man speak when they snatched him from the shore? Understand this. The liberation of black people in the West is tied to the liberation of Africa. As long as Africa is chained, we are not free. As long as Africa is looted, we are not wealthy. As long as Africa is mocked, we are not respected. Because no man, no woman, no child can truly walk tall when their mother is still kneeling. Africa is not poor, it is rich, but exploited by foreign powers. This truth is one of the greatest lies ever told to the modern world, and especially to the black man. When we speak of Africa, too often we are presented with images of starvation, war, and dust. Children with bloated stomachs, huts made of mud, and hopeless eyes. But let's ask a very simple question. If Africa is so poor, why is everyone fighting over it? Why do Western nations, foreign corporations, and global empires pour billions of dollars into African soil not to uplift it, but to extract from it? You do not rob the poor, you rob the wealthy. And Africa, from Cape to Cairo, is sitting on the kind of wealth that could shake the balance of the world if it were ever fully owned by its people. The continent of Africa holds the world's largest reserves of gold, diamonds, cobalt, platinum, uranium, and rare earth minerals. Yet its people remain impoverished not by fate, not by accident, but by design. While Europe was experiencing its so-called Renaissance, African societies were already rich in natural resources, political systems, and cultural traditions. Civilizations like Mali, Songhai, Axum, and Kemet thrived in trade, architecture, and scientific advancement. Timbuktu had universities before most of Europe had cities with clean water. But the moment the West discovered the riches beneath Africa's surface, it launched a campaign not just of theft, but of propaganda. They told the world that Africa needed saving, civilizing, reforming. In reality, it was the riches that needed seizing. Colonialism wasn't about charity, it was about conquest. They drew maps with rulers and ink while sitting in palaces, deciding which empire would get which portion of the motherland. They didn't ask the Africans. They didn't consult the tribes. They didn't care about the kingdoms. What they cared about was rubber in the Congo, diamonds in Botswana, oil in Angola, and fertile land from Kenya to Zimbabwe. They sent missionaries to baptize the soul while businessmen mined the gold. They taught Africans to kneel before a foreign god while stripping the land of its sacred resources. They replaced African names with European ones, African languages with colonial tongues, and African pride with colonial shame. The result? A generation cut off from its inheritance. Taught to believe that wealth is something found elsewhere, that greatness is something worn by men in white collars, and that freedom is something granted, not taken. But the exploitation didn't stop with independence. Independence was mostly flag deep. New governments wore new colors, but the hands reaching into Africa's pockets remained the same. Multinational corporations signed contracts with leaders willing to trade their people's futures for personal power. Loans came with strings, aid came with conditions, and military support came with control. The same nations that once held the whip now hold the checkbook, and through debt policy and manipulation, they continue to extract more than they ever give. Look at the diamond industry. The stones that sparkle in rings and shine on red carpets often come from African soil, mined by African hands under horrific conditions. Yet the profit goes to corporations based in Europe and America. Look at oil. Nigeria, Angola, and Sudan sit on oceans of oil. But their people live with blackouts, poverty, and pollution while foreign companies rake in billions. Even cocoa, the raw material for chocolate, comes primarily from Africa. Yet most African children have never even tasted the final product, while global brands get fat on African labor. The lie of African poverty is so deeply entrenched that many Africans believe it. The children are taught to dream of Europe, America, and the so-called First World as the places of opportunity. Meanwhile, they're sitting on a land that others have been killing for centuries. The psychological impact of this lie is devastating. When you convince a man he is poor while he sits on gold, he won't protect the gold, he'll beg for crumbs instead. And so the cycle continues. They offer aid packages with smiles while taking resources with contracts. They set up NGOs that raise money using pictures of starving children while ignoring the billions in profit extracted from the same land. The media reinforces this story: Africa is helpless, always in need, always behind. But this is not just misinformation, it is weaponized narrative. It is the continuation of colonialism through image and idea. It is the same old theft, dressed in modern clothes. Yet history tells us another story. The story of kingdoms that flourished, of scientists, poets, builders, and warriors, of gold flowing through the streets of Timbuktu, of people who knew how to farm, trade, govern, and build societies that lasted longer than any colonial regime. The idea that Africa was discovered by Europeans is not only insulting, it's absurd. You do not discover a people already building cities. You invade them. Africa's richness is not just in minerals. It is in culture, music, art, and spirituality. It is in resilience, in survival, in the wisdom passed down through generations. It is in the potential of its youth, the strength of its mothers, the fire of its revolutionaries. But until Africans and the descendants of Africa across the world understand that this richness is real, the exploitation will continue, because those who see Africa as weak will continue to dominate those who believe it. The moment that belief changes, everything else begins to shift. The lie loses its power. The narrative cracks, the thief is exposed, and the stolen wealth must be reckoned with. Black people worldwide are spiritually and historically connected to Africa. This connection runs deeper than borders, deeper than passports, deeper than language. It is a connection written in blood, carved into bone, encoded into the very soul of a people. This connection cannot be erased by time, distance, or colonization. It cannot be undone by ships that crossed the Atlantic or chains that bound wrists and ankles. It is a truth that lives within every man, woman, and child whose skin carries the sun, whose hair defies gravity, and whose ancestry reaches back to the mother continent. The African in America is not a stranger to Africa. He is a son separated by force. The Caribbean man is not a foreigner to African soil. He is the descendant of stolen royalty. The black child born in Brazil, France, or Britain is not rootless. He is rooted in a history older than empires. And though the oppressor has done everything to make black people forget that connection, through violence, education, religion, and culture, it still pulses beneath the surface, waiting to be reawakened. This is why the enemy worked so hard to destroy it. They didn't just break bodies, they broke memory. They didn't just tear down villages, they tore out identity. The whip wasn't just about pain, it was about transformation, turning a proud African into a confused slave, turning a man with a name into a numbered property. The erasure was not just physical. It was psychological, spiritual, generational. But a tree cannot deny its roots simply because it was transplanted. And no matter where the African has been scattered, the root remains the same. The language may be different. One speaks English, another French, another Portuguese, another Swahili. But the rhythm, the struggle, the resistance, the fire, it is the same. The culture may be reshaped, but the foundation is shared. The songs sung in Mississippi have echoes of the drums played in Senegal. The food cooked in Trinidad carries the spices of Ghana. The pride of the Jamaican speaks the same bold truth as the revolutionary in South Africa. Whether in Brooklyn or Nairobi, Lagos or Atlanta, the fight for dignity, justice, and liberation is one and the same. It is this unity the oppressor fears most, because when black people realize they are not just scattered victims of separate struggles, but one people, one voice, one spirit divided by colonial maps, that is when power is born. That is when movements rise. That is when borders mean nothing and solidarity means everything. They want the African American to think he has nothing to do with the African immigrant. They want the Caribbean man to look down on the African vendor. They want the black Londoner to see himself as superior to the man in Lagos. Because if they can keep the sons and daughters of Africa divided, they can keep them powerless. But when that illusion is shattered, when a black man in Chicago sees his reflection in a boy from Sierra Leone, when a sister in Haiti understands her ancestors walked the same land as the Zulu warrior, when the diaspora remembers that they are not alone, that they are not orphans, but family torn apart by conquest, then the game changes. Then the oppressor no longer controls the narrative, because the most powerful weapon of oppression is to make a people forget who they are and where they come from. And the most dangerous act of rebellion is to remember. It is not coincidence that Africa was the cradle of humanity. It is not coincidence that the richest cultures, the deepest philosophies, the oldest stories began there. It is not coincidence that from that soil, men and women rose who could shape the course of the earth. And it is no coincidence that the children of that land, wherever they are, carry the strength of survival, the brilliance of invention, and the courage of resistance. The connection to Africa is not a weakness. It is a wellspring of strength. It is not a burden. It is a birthright. It is not a shame. It is a badge of honor. To know that your ancestors survived the slave ship, the auction block, the plantation, the lynching tree, the segregation line, and still stood tall, that is not defeat. That is legacy. To know that they sang while shackled, prayed while hunted, loved while oppressed, that is not helplessness. That is power. That is endurance that no other people can claim in the same way. That is the spirit of Africa living through every generation. The connection is not theoretical. It is lived. It is breathed. It is in the eyes of every black child wondering where they belong. It is in the fists of every black man who rises against injustice. It is in the words of every black woman who refuses to be silenced. And it is not just about race. It is about origin. It is about belonging. It is about returning not in body but in awareness. Returning to the understanding that you are not the product of slavery. You are the descendant of greatness. You are not defined by chains. You are defined by ancestors who built civilizations and empires long before their captors ever knew what a bath was. This connection also carries responsibility. A people connected by blood must be connected by purpose. The suffering of one is the suffering of all. The liberation of one must be the goal of all. When a black man is killed in America, it is not just a domestic tragedy, it is a global injustice. When a child dies in Congo mining cobalt for Western devices, it is not a local crisis, it is a collective wound. The African diaspora cannot rise without Africa, and Africa cannot rise without its diaspora. The connection demands action, not just emotion. It demands solidarity, education, cooperation, and pride. It demands that we learn from each other, defend each other, and invest in each other. It demands that we stop allowing others to define who we are and where we belong. It demands that we write our own story, speak our own truth, and chart our own future, because we are not scattered seeds. We are branches of the same tree. We are echoes of the same drum. We are children of the same sun. Colonialism stripped Africans of identity, unity, and justice, not just land. The damage done by colonial rule runs deeper than territory. It ripped apart the soul of a continent. When the invaders came, they didn't just take what was above the ground. They tore away what was inside the people. They didn't just redraw borders, they reshaped minds. They didn't just plunder gold, diamonds, and rubber. They plundered names, languages, traditions, belief systems, and pride. Colonialism was not just theft, it was erasure. It was the deliberate dismantling of a people's sense of self so they could be more easily controlled. Before colonizers landed on African shores, the people had systems, political systems, spiritual systems, educational systems. They had kingdoms and councils, elders and oracles, laws that didn't require prisons, wisdom passed down not in books but in stories, rituals, and lived experience. There were empires that governed with sophistication, Mali, Ghana, Songhai, Benin, Congo, and Ethiopia, systems that functioned without needing outside influence. But the colonizer didn't recognize civilization unless it wore European clothes and spoke a European language. So they called Africa uncivilized to justify their invasion. Ignoring the rich heritage standing before them, they arrived with guns in one hand and Bibles in the other. They baptized children into foreign names and foreign gods, telling them their own ancestors were heathens. They made African spirituality something to be feared, mocked, or forgotten. They taught generations to see their own traditions as backward, primitive, and demonic. They taught Africans to look to Europe for light, as though their own cultures had never known the sun. This spiritual theft was deliberate. A people who no longer believed in their own gods would more easily bow to foreign kings. A people who lost connection to their ancestors would more readily obey foreign laws. And with that spiritual colonization came the destruction of identity. The names changed first. Kwame became Joseph. Nanana became Mary. Children were punished for speaking their own languages, beaten for dressing in traditional ways, mocked for practicing the customs of their people. Over time, many began to believe the lie, that to be African was to be backward. That to be European was to be advanced. That salvation, success, and civilization all looked like the colonizer. They were not just conquered by armies, they were conquered by ideas. Colonization of the mind became the most enduring legacy of European imperialism. But the erasure didn't stop at identity. It stretched to unity. Before colonialism, African societies were not perfect, but they had their own forms of cohesion. Tribes and ethnic groups had their rivalries, yes, but they also had trade, marriage, migration, and diplomacy. The colonizers saw strength in that unity, so they shattered it. They drew artificial borders that cut through communities, forcing enemies to live under one flag while separating families with another. The map of Africa today is a European creation, not an African one. It reflects not the will of the people, but the greed of the empires. Divide and rule became the mantra. They empowered one tribe over another. They gave guns and favors to the few while oppressing the many. They stoked ethnic tensions where none existed. They planted seeds of mistrust, ensuring that even after independence, African nations would be too divided to challenge the global order. And when civil wars broke out, when coups and dictators rose, the former colonizers feigned surprise. But those fires were lit with colonial matches. Those wounds were cut with colonial knives. The chaos was not a result of African failure. It was a result of colonial design. Justice, too, was stripped away. Traditional systems of justice were displaced by foreign courts, foreign laws, and foreign judges. Systems that once focused on restoration, balance, and community were replaced with systems focused on punishment and control. The colonial courts did not serve justice. They served empire. Africans were jailed for resisting occupation, flogged for breaking colonial curfews, executed for fighting for their own freedom. The colonizer decided who was innocent and who was guilty. And the verdict was almost always the same. If you resisted, you were a criminal. If you submitted, you were civilized. Even after the colonizers left, they didn't really leave. They left behind puppet regimes, economic structures, and legal systems that still served their interests. They left behind debts, dependencies, and doctrines. They replaced colonial flags with national ones, but the rules remained the same. Trade agreements still favored the West. Raw materials still flowed out of Africa. Wealth still flowed in the wrong direction. Justice remained elusive for the masses, while power was concentrated in the hands of the elite. And many of those elites were trained, financed, and protected by the very nations that once enslaved their people. Colonialism made Africans question themselves. It made them doubt their own value, their own intelligence, their own beauty. It created generations of people who believed the enemy was their neighbor, not the man who drew the map. It created school systems that taught European history as global history, European philosophy as universal truth, and European heroes as the world's saviors. African children grew up knowing more about the Queen of England than the Queen of Sheba. They were taught to admire Churchill but not Lumumba, to memorize the names of French poets while forgetting the greats of their own land. The damage of colonialism is not just in the past. It is living in the present. It is in the boardrooms where decisions are still made without African voices. It is in the currencies still tied to European control. It is in the education systems that do not teach the greatness that came before the slave ships. It is in the beauty standards that worship whiteness. It is in the news headlines that always describe Africa as a continent of crisis, never a cradle of creativity. It is in the laws, the borders, the bureaucracy, and the broken trust between brothers divided by language, religion, and flag. But that theft of land, identity, unity, and justice was never complete. It could not erase the soul of the people. It could not destroy the truth buried in the bones of elders, the fire in the music, the rhythm of the language, the wisdom in the stories passed down. That is why the fight to reclaim what was stolen is not just political, it is spiritual, it is cultural, it is psychological. Because liberation is not only about land, it is about memory. It is about restoring what was taken and rebuilding what was broken. True black liberation is impossible without African liberation. The chains that bind black people in America, the Caribbean, South America, and Europe are forged from the same metal that still shackles Africa. The poverty in Detroit is linked to the exploitation in Congo. The police brutality in London echoes the militarized suppression in Nigeria. The systemic racism faced by the black man in France mirrors the systemic theft of resources from Angola. These are not isolated struggles, they are parts of the same war. A war not just against black bodies, but against black power. And until Africa is free economically, politically, and culturally, black people across the globe will continue to fight with one hand tied behind their backs. Africa is the motherland, not just in geography, but in spirit. It is the source of black identity, black pride, and black potential. But as long as Africa is portrayed as weak, helpless, and corrupt, black people everywhere are seen through that same lens. As long as Africa is exploited, black labor and black lives are undervalued across the world. Because if the root is seen as rotten, how can the branches expect to be respected? If Africa is not allowed to rise, black people globally are denied their foundation. The world cannot afford to see Africa as strong, united, and self-sufficient, because that would mean the end of black inferiority narratives. That would mean black dignity no longer needs validation from the West. Liberation is more than civil rights. It's more than representation. It's more than individual success stories. It is collective power. It is the ability to build, protect, and sustain independent communities. And no black community can claim true independence while the homeland is under siege. The minerals in African soil fund the phones we use. the weapons we face, the wealth of the corporations that dominate us. Yet the African nations that produce those minerals remain at the mercy of international banks, Western donors, and foreign policies written in languages their ancestors never spoke. Liberation means ending that dependence. It means Africa no longer needing permission to thrive. There is a reason why global institutions fear African unity, why Pan-Africanism has been attacked, infiltrated, and undermined for decades. Because if black people across the world began to see their liberation as tied to Africa's rise, new alliances would form that could disrupt the global power structure. Imagine African Americans investing in African infrastructure. Imagine Caribbean leaders forming trade deals with Ghana, Nigeria, and Kenya instead of former colonizers. Imagine African nations controlling their own ports, media, and industries, while black professionals from the diaspora bring skills, technology, and capital back home. That kind of movement would terrify the powers that be. But too often, black liberation movements are forced to disconnect from Africa. They're told to focus on local issues, to assimilate, to prove their worth within Western systems. Africa is presented as irrelevant, foreign, or embarrassing. This is not by accident. It is a strategy. Because if black people turn their backs on Africa, they turn their backs on their power source. If they believe the lie that Africa has nothing to offer, they remain consumers, not builders. And as long as the West defines Africa by poverty and corruption, black people who identify with it are seen as inherently inferior, no matter how high they climb. This is why the liberation of Africa must be at the center of any global black liberation movement. It is not a side issue, it is the core. Because when Africa is strong, it sets the terms of engagement, it chooses its allies, it protects its children, no matter where they are in the world. When Africa has power, black people everywhere gain leverage. When Africa produces its own medicine, its own weapons, its own food, and its own media, it cannot be bullied or manipulated. When Africa tells its own story, black people no longer need to beg for representation. When Africa stands tall, black people don't need to shrink themselves to fit into systems that were never built for them. Liberation also means psychological freedom, and for many in the diaspora, that means unlearning centuries of lies about Africa. It means moving past the propaganda of savagery, chaos, and disease. It means seeing Africa not just as a place of origin, but as a future, a place to invest, to visit, to learn from, to build with. It means understanding that Africa's freedom is not charity, it is strategy. It is survival, because the enemies of black people have always understood this connection. That's why they worked so hard to break it. That's why they flooded Africa with missionaries, warlords, and debt collectors. That's why they trained African leaders to mimic European values while ignoring African realities. That's why they taught African children that success means leaving the continent. But black liberation requires going back, not just physically, but mentally and politically. It means forging bonds across oceans. It means knowing that a struggle in Johannesburg is linked to one in Chicago. That justice in Accra is justice in Atlanta. That when Africa wins, every descendant of Africa walks taller. This is not romanticism. This is resistance. Because a fractured people are easy to control. But a people united across continents, across struggles, across centuries, that kind of people cannot be defeated. The chain that once dragged our ancestors across the Atlantic can become a lifeline, a link of strength, a path back to wholeness. To talk about black freedom without Africa is to build a house without a foundation. It might stand for a while, but it won't last. It will always be at the mercy of storms. But when Africa is free to define itself, govern itself, feed itself, and protect itself, then black people everywhere gain a refuge, a voice, a home. A place that doesn't just tolerate their blackness, but honors it. A place where their history is not a footnote, but a headline. A place that doesn't demand assimilation, but encourages elevation. A place that doesn't exploit them, but uplifts them. A place that reminds them they were never meant to be slaves, consumers, or outsiders. They were meant to be rulers, builders, protectors, and creators.